Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa. It is wonderful to see you on the Weekly Hoon. Peter Bale, our co-host from his moonlighting job.
Yes, exactly. I actually intended to change the angle slightly to have a more interesting selection of books behind me, because it just, we do have, it's a great coffee table bookshop and very, very good novels and so on. But I can see I've got it pointed at the camera, or my backdrop at least, is the sort of crime and drama section, like Lee Child and all of those kinds of ones. Now, are you in your new office that Mrs. Hickey has created for you?
You're in trouble now. never called in Mrs. Hickey. No, it's a slightly different version of it with a new light to highlight the beauty of the back of my head.
Yes,
so
good.
That's where we are. It's good to see.
And by the look of it, you've been for a swim today too?
Oh yeah, no, and I haven't washed my hair yet, so it is all over the place.
I think actually maybe we could get some Bernard dreads going as well.
Oh no! The trouble is I don't have enough, and it keeps falling out. So there's a point with dreadlocks where, at a certain age, it doesn't really work. Things start receding.
No, I think yes, possibly like tattoos. Or have you got tattoos, Bernard? I've never noticed tattoos on you, but
no, I haven't. I saved myself a lot of money. This is what I do when I talk to the young people. I say, stop eating the avocado toast and drinking the flat whites and getting tattoos. You should get yourself a deposit for a first home.
Yeah.
No.
So people are saying on the YouTube that they've got no pictures again, which I think there will be. I mean, it is a podcast, so they'll. And I wonder actually if it might be bandwidth from me that's causing this problem. But I mean, anyway, Simon is on the job. So Bernard, what have you been up to this week in the kaka? I mean, it's been an interesting week from the coalition point of view, and I think we're going to have a session with a political expert, an academic political expert. Is that right?
That's right. In the second half of the show, we'll speak to Professor Lara Greaves, who is from the University of Victoria and also works with the University of Auckland, about an interesting gap that's opening up in the political views of men and women. And this is not something that's just happening in New Zealand. All around the world, women, and especially young women, are trending more liberal and more left, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
Men, and particularly young men, are trending more conservative or populist or right-wing, whichever way you want to describe it. And it's interesting, just in the last couple of months in Aotearoa, we have seen a massive gap open up where women, and actually in this case, older women, have turned their back on the government in a huge way. In today's email, which I've just opened up to make it public because we got more than 100 likes from our paying subscribers, a report on a Roy Morgan survey which came out overnight, which looks at the right track, wrong track measure of support for the government. It's the government confidence rating. It's a long-running part of the survey. Other political pollsters also do right track, wrong track. In many ways, it's another test of how people feel about how the nation, the economy, the government is performing. And often it is when it moves, and it often moves in tandem with consumer confidence, you eventually see a flow through into a change of views about politics.
Shall we not go into too much detail on that though before she's on? Because I mean, otherwise we'll do that entire session then. And what else have you been?
That's something to look forward to. And the other thing I've been focusing on this week is what's happening with the government's strategy for infrastructure and for government finance, and an excellent research note that came out towards the end of last week and the beginning of this week, showing how councils actually could borrow more if there were a couple of tweaks to things at a centralised level with the local government funding agency, and of course, always it comes back to the politics of rates, taxes, debt, mortgage rates, and of course the fundamental truth of our housing market with bits tacked on, which is that people are in it for the tax-free capital gains that are leveraged, and they don't want that to change.
Oh
When I
no,
say
Bernard,
people-
no, that's not true. They need to have mortgage tax deductibility, interest deductibility in order to contribute to creating, a greater renter economy, or in this case, rentier economy.
Yeah, I mean that's one way to frame the area of aspiration, which is that we can all become landlords. And hang on a minute, that doesn't work, does it?
No,
Because
not quite.
you need some
Yeah,
tenants.
no, but bugger. And that, what? No, but if we're only doing it for capital gains, we can just put them put our children in them, get the mortgage tax deductibility, and undercharge our children, and create intergenerational wealth. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, that's just not how it's working at the moment. Instead, people are leaving the country. Interesting this week, I included a plea from 86 unnamed scientists at Callaghan Innovation pleading for the government not to sack a bunch of scientists and to downgrade investment in
I suspect they're probably going
science
to sack
and
most
R&D.
of Callaghan as well, but judging by Callaghan's own performance and what the government is talking about, I suspect they're going
Yeah,
to.
the performance is an interesting thing. For science, it's really hard to judge it in the same way that you judge
Absolutely it is.
a company's performance quarter by quarter, which seems to be the way the current Prime Minister likes to do it. And it's very clear that economies, societies that invest heavily in R&D, in science, and not just commercialized science, but deep background science, the sort of stuff that you think, I could spend my whole career on this and nothing will actually be produced. But I know that in 2 or 3 generations' time, it's going to save the world.
That's
or kill
how
it.
that's how graphene was discovered. All of those things. And I was actually pleased to hear on the radio this morning a company I had done some work on for Newsroom, Kia Aerospace in Christchurch, owned or founded by the improbably named Mark Rocket, who changed his name to Rocket after an involvement with Rocket Lab. Kia is going to be working with NASA on its amazing solar-powered stratospheric drones, which are going to be flying around, powered by the sun, and do what sounds like extraordinary coastal monitoring of pollution. I suspect they'll also be very soon flying quite a long way offshore, and doing coastal monitoring of our exclusive economic zone.
Yeah, I mean, there's some amazing work that's being done to try to do things in a sustainable and renewable way. A lot of incredibly hardworking, intelligent, and sometimes well-funded people working their butts off because we face a catastrophe.
An amazing
Like
set of
an
opportunities.
we
Speaking
have to fight for our lives, basically.
speaking of creative and well paid, there's Catherine.
Catherine,
There's a few more things you got wrong today.
So, Catherine, yet again, I was thinking about you this morning when I was getting into a Twitter stoush with a twerp who was the New Zealand First candidate for Lower Hutt, who constantly posts things about how great Donald Trump is and how great Winston Peters is in the same breath, and was posting something about the Arctic ice cap the ice cap being better than expected, and that was therefore overturning the entire climate debate. But then fortunately I found a piece from a couple of days ago from Inside Climate News disabusing of that. So I can now still go to battle with my right-wing nutters. Catherine, would you please give us more information and more material?
Good for you. Well, this week, what we're covering is a report that's come out from Global Energy Monitor, which is looking at the plans for new oil and gas field developments. I know this is something we've talked about before, but this new report, I think, is worth mentioning in the sense that they've reported. So in 2023, the approvals for new oil and gas field developments rebounded back to what they were pre-COVID. So they took a bit of a dip for a while. And they're looking at the plans out to 2030 and saying that they are planning to quadruple what 2023's new development investments look like in new fossil oil and gas fields. And this is what's been approved by governments or sanctioned to go ahead. So that really kind of is at odds with what we would need to do if we wanted to keep warming under control. So the International Energy Agency, the IEA, back in 2021 said that if we wanted to stick to 1.5 degrees of warming, there could be no new development of new oil and gas fields. And since that time, about 20 billion barrels equivalent have been approved. So we're already, I think we all kind of understand that we're already heading for somewhere north of 1.5 degrees. But yeah, this report is saying that by 2030 we'll quadruple the amount that was approved in 2023. So it gets even worse.
So this really is the time when big oil and gas, who for a decade or so have been saying the right things about being part of the transition and helping us cut our addiction to oil and gas, and we just need a little bit of help from gas in particular to make the transition into electricity. Just hang in with us, guys. We've got a lot of money we could invest in this renewable stuff. Watch us invest, because we're BP, Beyond Petroleum, and all of that. Some pretty green colors on our logos, but the mask has come off really now. And there was a moment, could you tell us about it, Catherine, with the head of Saudi Aramco a couple of weeks ago, which basically said, game over. Yeah, nah, they're not actually serious about this.
Yeah, so the head of Saudi Aramco is the CEO in NASA. He was at a conference. It was a conference for oil and gas people, so, you know, as you might expect. But he got up and said that the current energy transition strategy is visibly failing on all fronts, first of all. And second of all, that policymakers should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas. And there was quite a bit of applause for that at the conference. But for the rest of us, I mean, what that means is, you know, like I said, the IEA is also been saying that demand for fossil fuels is going to peak next year or the year after, or maybe even the year after that, but certainly in the next couple of years. And if that happens, then all of these people that are saying that are putting their money behind investing in these new oil and gas field developments are going to end up with a lot of stranded assets, in which case you end up with kind of a financial crisis, you know, with all of that money lost. But if they're right and there is still demand for that and the IEA is wrong, then we end up with a climate transition crisis where, you know, we're still putting CO2 into the atmosphere at much higher rates than anybody's currently predicting in their curves. So, you know, we're basically looking at two slightly different coloured crises in the future, and you can bet your money either way on where you think it's actually going to go, or where you think it's going to wind up.
Yeah, or you could bet your money on the science, or at least understand what's happening with the science, and look at what it's doing to inflation. So, you know, I've got this view that it always comes down to house prices and interest rates, and often they're a function of what's happening with inflation. So, Catherine, what have we learned about climate change and food price inflation this week?
Yeah, so there was another report that came out this week that basically looked at the effect of climate change on food price inflation, and found that, yes, there definitely is a link, and the link is particularly strong in those places that are already hotter, and in those seasons that are hotter. But they're predicting that within about a decade or so, the amount of inflation in food prices will be about 3 percentage points per year as a result of climate change effects. And that also translates into a general inflationary pressure of somewhere between sort of 1.3 and 1.8%. And we know that most central banks are charged with keeping inflation rates below something like 2%. So if most of that is already going to be taken up with food price inflation because of climate change, then you can see lots of pressure starting to come on there. But the other important point to point out is that a lot of the places that are going to feel this the most strongly, the hotter places, a lot of them are in the global south. And so they will face more of this food price inflation, but also food makes up a much bigger proportion of people's budgets, weekly or daily budgets in those countries. And so any inflation in food has a massive impact on their ability to live their lives well. So the human welfare impacts of that are pretty significant, and much more so in the places in the world that have contributed least to the problem of climate change.
And one of the ironies here of this feedback loop is that with that extra 1-2 percentage points of inflation from climate change, which because it's not a linear thing is probably not going to be a stable thing, and it's unlikely to be falling, the reserve banks of the world, who aren't allowed to look through climate change in the way that they can look through other one-off shocks, because this isn't really a one-off shock, will be putting up interest rates to try to control climate change. And one of the ironies here is that the higher they put up interest rates, the more expensive and difficult it is to invest in the renewable electricity generation that we need. So there's an inbuilt feedback loop in here, which is stopping our ability to deal with climate change. And it's because of climate change. And I think there's an argument that central banks should start to include the effects of not just a one-off shock, but a multi-year, multi-decade shock to inflation from climate change in their thinking about monetary policy. Otherwise, they risk worsening this feedback loop. And it's a fundamental problem. Not only do they have some financial stability issues with climate change, i.e. suddenly all these banks have a bunch of unsaleable homes and mortgages and insurances on their hands, but also they have a monetary policy system and tool that is working against the world's need for renewable energy. Now, just one final thing, Catherine, before we head off.
No, I have a final thing, Bernard, because let me, you do the final thing. But
go for it.
Catherine, one of our readers, Alistair Shawn, or listeners, asks about this investment that you're seeing from the oil majors. I think I know the answer of this to Aramco and, say, the investments that Qatar are making, but is it coming from new funding, or is it coming from their existing sort of cash flow and reserves? So are non-oil companies investing in the oil companies?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. I imagine that it's coming from all sorts of places, because people will follow the money, and if they think that, but the bet that's been made there is that demand for fossil fuels will continue into the future.
Yeah.
If they're wrong about that bet, they'll lose a lot of money. If they're right about that bet, we'll lose a lot of livability of the planet.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm feeling. I did an interview this week with Anthony Lowenstein about Gaza, and he reckons that the two-state solution is dead and has always been dead and is just a myth. And I wonder whether this is a little bit like the two-state solution, that we'll stick to sort of net zero commitments that everybody pretends to believe in and pretends to advocate, but has no intention of actually doing the hard work to get there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of language that we've been using for quite a while in respect to some of these issues that has been quite, that has been very good at hiding behind. And that's, things like net versus absolute zero carbon emissions, unabated versus abated. So this comes into things like CS, climate capture and storage. Now that's a technology that is highly funded by oil and gas interests. So they're putting a lot of money into, even into some of the universities and institutes that are researching that stuff. They've put a lot of money behind it, because if you can go out and say, well, we have a technical solution that's going to come online down the line a little bit that will take all of the emissions out of the stuff, then we can keep doing business as usual. We can keep finding new fossil fuels and pulling it up, and we'll just take the emissions out. But at some point in the future, when all of this technology kind of pays off for us,
we'll just re-inject it back into the places where we've fracked.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of narratives and discourses that kind of hide what's going on underneath, which is the fact that we're not reducing. The main thing that causes climate change is burning fossil fuels, and we're not really doing nearly enough to reduce that.
Just a quick bit of research I've done on the cash flow coming out of the oil companies and the investment they're doing, Saudi Aramco, which Catherine mentioned earlier, produces free cash flow from its operating activities of 95 billion US dollars a year. It pays out dividends of around 20 or 30 billion. It actually borrows some money as well, and is investing upwards of $100 billion a year in new oil and gas production. So it's pretty much self-funded. It's amazing how much cash you get with a $90 a barrel oil price. And it's one of those perfect machines. They've done the investment. They didn't have to pay for the oil. It's underneath their feet. And they don't have to build new refineries. They don't have to build new plants. They just keep pumping, and there is profitable oil for them. Now, some of the others, it's more expensive if you're digging in the Arctic, or you're having to turn oil sands in Canada into oil. But the Saudis, it's why all the world sports events are now being held in Saudi Arabia, not where they should be held.
And Aramco is, sponsoring everything in the world it can get to. So it is
Yes.
very. If you look at Formula One,
Except
which
our
I do,
podcast, which is good.
Aramco. Oh no, actually, that's a bloody good idea. Brought to you by Aramco.
No, it's
I like
not.
it. I think it's a very good idea.
Catherine, thank you so much. Lovely to see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Hi,
And
Robert.
lovely
Hi,
to
here's
welcome
Professor
Hello.
Robert Patman.
Hello, how
Yes,
are you,
talk about-
guys?
Fantastic. Good. There's a lot of bad things happening in the world, but I must say I'm finding it quite satisfying covering them and trying to understand them. Geopolitics affects everything. We just spent 10 minutes talking with Catherine about how climate change, rising oil prices, higher inflation is affecting us all. And geopolitics, boy, you really need to understand what's going on in the Middle East to understand what's happening with the price of your fuel, with the technology we're seeing in drones, what's happening with data cables under the Red Sea. I mean, it's affecting everything. Peter, I wanted to throw it over to you after an excellent roundup of the news which went out on your Substack today, which I referred to everyone ahead of the Hoon.
Thank you. Only
Go
a
for
couple
it,
of
Peter.
stories, but Robert, I'm interested in this fallout, or I hope this fallout from the deaths of the 7 aid workers for Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen in Gaza. I mean, there's something weird, of course, that it takes the death of foreigners in an incident like us to sort of prick our ears up a little bit, but it certainly made Netanyahu look discomforted, except that there's all this stuff happens in war, and as Jose Andres said, Biden may say he supports us, but he's still sending all the weaponry and materiel to Israel. I noticed that the UK. There was a leaked Foreign Office document this week, legal advice to the Foreign Office, suggesting that the UK really probably ought to stop selling weapons to Israel at the moment, given the plausible genocide claim. What do you make of an incident like this, where it's said to be an accident, and yet 3 different cars in a convoy were destroyed by an unbelievably accurate Israeli weapon?
Well, certainly the boss of World Kitchens, the organisation that's been affected, dismissed the idea that this was some sort of oops or mistake moment, and has been quite clear that not only did the team carefully communicate with the IDF before they even set on their journey, but they actually maintained, after the first strike apparently, appealed to the Israelis to acknowledge what they'd previously acknowledged, that they are purely humanitarians, but the strikes continued. So, yes, I think you're right, Peter. The world's attention is drawn to the fact that an Australian, 3 Brits, a Canadian were amongst those killed. But I think it might sober up some of the liberal democracies who've been giving Netanyahu the benefit of the doubt up to now. We have to take into account 190 Palestinian humanitarian workers have been killed, and
100 journalists.
there hasn't been any comparable outrage. But
That's
I
right.
think there is a growing sense amongst, and I was listening to an interview with the Spanish Prime Minister the other day. I think there's a growing awareness now, not least in Australia, that Netanyahu is acting with impunity. relative impunity. And the United States is getting itself into absolute knots. I was watching John Kirby, I should say, the administration, the Biden administration's one of the press people, and in a press conference, he made the incredible claim that up to in the first 6 months of the Israeli military campaign, that they hadn't detected any serious breaches of humanitarian law, which led the assembled journalists to be absolutely dismissive.
Yeah.
And it is an extraordinary situation. Will it make a big impact is really the nub of your question. I think the United States is looking more and more isolated. Only the United States can stop Israel at the moment. It doesn't seem to have the political will to do so. The cost to the long-standing reputation of the United States, I think, is considerable. I think many of the other liberal democracies, many of whom governments are under pressure from their own population, both Germany and Britain their governments have been quite roundly criticised by large numbers of their population in the last few days for giving arms. Australia, by the way, has provided arms as well. So one would hope it represents something of a turning point, but we've had a few turning points, haven't we, before?
What did you make, Robert, of Benny Gantz, who's an opposition member in the war cabinet, saying that there should be elections in September? I mean, I interviewed Anthony Lowenstein, who you may have come across, who published a book last year called The Palestinian Laboratory, which is all about the surveillance state and the way Israel markets itself to authoritarian governments. And his view was that we really have to be careful just hoping, in a sense, that Netanyahu goes, because the sentiments that underlie his views are very widely spread, both in the Israeli public and certainly in Israeli politics. So what do you make of this idea of an election in September?
Well, it certainly puts more pressure on Netanyahu. I take your point about Benny Gantz not necessarily being a dramatic departure. Gantz seems to have backed what many Israelis call the war against Hamas, but it doesn't look like a war. It looks like a military onslaught. This is not a battle between two near equals. This is a one-way onslaught. The Hamas haven't got any air intercept capabilities or anything like that. They just sit there and take it. And they hope for the odd ambush.
Robert, I thought it was interesting also, Robert, the story, partly in The Guardian, but also on an Israeli site called Plus 972, which is an investigation into this system called Lavender, which is an artificial intelligence-driven targeting aid, where they found, I think, 37,000 supposedly Hamas potential targets, i.e. people. But this idea of a ratio that it was legitimate to kill up to 20 civilians at the same time as you targeted one relatively low-level Hamas target. That really does show you the kind of calculus between in a very cynical way, between civilian deaths and what you're actually going for. A 20-to-1 ratio, 20 civilians to every Hamas gunman.
There's 2 points that I'd make, Peter. I think, yes, it's very sobering that people at the decision-making end in Tel Aviv seem to be relatively indifferent about the loss of civilians who may have something very little to do with the original Hamas action. But there's a second point, and it's more serious. And it's been made by a number of serious people in the United States and elsewhere, that this violates every central tenet of a sound counter-terrorist operation. You simply do not factor in the death of civilians if you're serious about going after terrorists. You make a big demarcation. And speaking to military people and counter-terrorist specialists, they are appalled at the idea that there's no line between civilians and military targets. Because after all, in a counter-terrorist operation, you want to isolate and target the so-called, militant targets or the fighters. And you do not want to kill people who are not involved, because otherwise you replicate the cycle of violence again. You simply act as a recruiting sergeant for Hamas. This is why this strategy was always flawed from the beginning. If they were serious about disabling Hamas, they should have sent in an elite small counter-terrorist group, special forces group, to deal with this. You can't effectively carry out collective punishment of the whole population. The big question that needs to be asked is Israel, is it more secure after 6 months onslaught in Gaza than it was before? I don't think so. And the reason this campaign, to some extent, has politically boosted Hamas. There's lots of grieving families amongst the Palestinians who will not accept the denial of their state now, and they're prepared to be more prepared than before to use violence to achieve it. So
I saw an interesting study recently of the percentage, which I think was the majority of Hamas recruits who are orphans, who've been orphaned from previous conflicts. I mean, it is, as you say, just perpetuating it.
The other thing that's really interesting, Peter, though, about all this episode is how weak the United States has been throughout this crisis. And watching the bobbing and weaving at their press conferences while they're desperately trying to say, well, we regret the civilian casualties. Oh, but by the way, we've just got a new arms agreement and we're releasing another clutch of 2,000-pound bombs to the Israelis. It just, speaking out both sides of your mouth, does actually run into serious problems over a sustained period. It's a balancing act. You might be able to perform for a couple of weeks, but over 6 months, I'm afraid it unravels. And the United States the Biden administration, unfortunately, to me, as John Mearsheimer has said repeatedly, American scholar, who's been highly critical of American policy towards Gaza, the tail is really wagging the dog.
Yeah,
and
Mr.
Really Biden doesn't. Robert, he looks very weak in handling this crisis. Sorry.
It's a really good time, actually. We should possibly put it into the show notes, if not for this, then for later. The Mearsheimer report of about 10 years ago, I think it was, when he and his colleague did a remarkable analysis of how American foreign policy was totally distorted by the support it gave to Israel. And he was accused of being a self-hating Jew and so on. And but it's this is not a new problem, but it would be very interesting to revisit John Mearsheimer on this, I think.
Yeah,
and there is a fallout for America's watering down, self-destruction of its own reputation as a honest broker, or at least somehow connected to the rules-based international system. Robert, you and a colleague wrote an op-ed this week, which was very interesting, on AUKUS 2 and whether or not New Zealand should join AUKUS 2. It's obviously been considered. But could you take us through your argument about whether we should, given this issue with the United States?
Well, first of all, the official rationale, Marco de Jong and myself largely Marco obtained them under the Official Information Act, access to some of the records from government agencies, defence and foreign affairs, relating to AUKUS. And the official rationale spelt out in the documents is that AUKUS is designed to uphold the international rules-based order against threats in the Indo-Pacific, and the unspoken threat, but clearly present, was the threat of China. So basically, this AUKUS arrangement sees China as the major and significant threat to the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. The problem is, as we point out in the article, this is bad strategy because the threat of China is real and no one has any illusions about it, but it's not the only threat. As we've seen in the last 4 to 5 months, we've seen also the threat from New Zealand's point of view to the rules-based order from multiple sources. US great power exceptionalism is one, where the United States ignores the majority view within the UN General Assembly to keep vetoing moves for a ceasefire. There are other threats. Russian expansionism is another one. There's multiple threats. UN security dysfunction is another major threat that Peter Fraser anticipated back in the 40s and has, unfortunately, and we've discussed this before, so I won't bang on about it, but unfortunately, after 9/11, the veto privilege has become an agent of destabilization in the global security environment. So when you sit down and think about it, and also we've got serious tensions in the Pacific. All these factors, from New Zealand's point of view, are serious threats to a rules-based order. And I think there's been some confusion because I think some of the officials that have been quite bullish in their estimates of AUKUS have confused what might be described as the US rules-based order with the international rules-based order. I mean, New Zealand definitely has a big stake in the latter rather than the former, I believe.
Robert, thank you so much for
Thank you.
Coming on and talking about that. And we'll
Thanks
include
as
in
always,
the show
Robert.
notes
Thank you.
the links to that op-ed from this week, which was really well argued. I'd like to
Thank you.
welcome into
Thanks,
the
Robert.
Hoon now Lara Greaves, who is an associate professor, a political scientist at the Victoria University of Wellington. And Lara, it's great to have you on the show.
Kia ora. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Laura. Good to have you. Thank you.
And Lara, I was keen to talk about an issue that's cropped up in overseas as well as here in recent months. The signs from the data, from surveys and from election results, showing there's a gap opening up in the political views and the parties that are supported between women, particularly young women, and men, and particularly young men. Could you talk a bit more about what you're seeing globally, and also what your work in trying to understand these surveys and political views have found here?
Yeah, so I'm a quantitative political scientist that focuses a lot on New Zealand. And when looking at the 2020 election, we're really looking at things like populism and generational differences. I'm talking about the New Zealand election study. When we look at that sort of data, sorry, literally like what's happened in the room that I'm in is window cleaners have appeared right next to me. So if I'm distracted, sorry, like of all times when I'm recording, right? So looking at the New Zealand election study, we're quantitative political scientists. We look at 3,000 to 4,000 New Zealanders' views every year. When we've been looking in recent years at the 2020 election, looking across generations, across genders, seeing that there's actually some really interesting things emerging in Gen Z. Now, Gen Z, the youngest, kind of up to 28 years of age, they at this point, so we couldn't really do the data on them back then. But what I was really seeing, like sitting there analyzing the data one day, kind of having to do a double take on it, because the average kind of level or the average kind of policy level when it came to matters of sexism, right wing, left wing, the Gen Z men were kind of sitting exactly where the interwar men were sitting. You know, the men that are kind of their great grandfathers, the kind of the much older men. And I was kind of going, what's happening with this data? Well, when you look at them, you drill down into them, there's a pocket of them that have moved quite far right. And so I'm just really keen at some point to get more into the data in New Zealand, whether it be through Vote Compass or the New Zealand election study, to see if that's happening here, because we can kind of see this trend around the world of men and women kind of drifting apart politically. And, you know, there's a lot of things we can think about in terms of sociology, in terms of political science, and all of those sort of public opinion, psychology research as to what's happening there. We hear all these arguments about, you know, what it means to be a man in the modern day and masculinity. And we're hearing a lot of them around ethnicity in New Zealand as well, and what it means to be Pākehā or tangata tiriti or New Zealand European. So there's all that kind of literature emerging as well in that space. And I think that, yeah, we are fundamentally seeing that drifting apart.
Is it real, Lara? Is it actually drifting apart? I mean, like, are you seeing enough data to believe it to be a phenomenon?
I would say yes. So I had a student, Rebecca Lloyd, who went back to the 1990s for her master's and looked at the election studies going back again like 30 years and looked at a whole bunch of different policy issues, looked at the left-right divide in New Zealand and didn't really find a reliable gender difference. Now, when we look at the last couple of elections, we started to see more on that Labour national, the men and women drifting apart a bit on the Labour and national thing. And I think looking at that data at the time, I attributed that to like women relating to and liking Jacinda Ardern. But it's actually kind of now that there's that broader possibility that we are seeing some kind of gender split or gender divide, or the traditional literature calls it a gender cleavage, because we saw that in like 1950s.
Jesus, 1960s. Gender cleavage, that seems a bit sexist in its own.
Not modern.
Yeah, but Lara, also, I was wondering, is there any split within women? Because it's very notable, perhaps because I just spend too much time on social media, there are women of a certain age who are clear, in many cases, very clearly concerned about what it means to be a woman, and then there are women of a generally younger age, I would assert, who are very comfortable or express great comfort with the idea of trans women,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, of trans people. So, are you seeing splits emerge in some of those areas amongst women themselves, the category of
Not
women?
en masse, not as large. I'd say that the ones that I've looked at mainly have been age and generational differences, where you do see that interwar women are more conservative. And actually, in New Zealand, we've got this interesting thing where our baby boomers aren't as conservative as other baby boomers around the world. Like, I like to attribute that to, the Springbok tour and the feminist movements and the Māori Renaissance and those kind of movements within our boomer generation. So we see that kind of interesting
There are no boomers
tendency.
on this show, Lara. Well, there's only one actually. I'm
It's like
sorry.
any boomer listeners can pat themselves on the back. But it's like it is one of those things where it's like trying to test some of those differences in New Zealand are interesting, of course, because we have Wahine Māori, we have Pacifica women as well at pretty large numbers, and we actually see a lot of differences there in political opinions as well, with Māori and Pacifica women being more kind of left wing. For various economic issues as well. So that's, I'd
Bernard's
say, where
just
we
burning to ask you a question, but I have one as well I'd like to ask you afterwards, please.
Lara, one of the reasons I gave you a call was because this week we've seen from Roy Morgan a gender and age group breakdown of what's happening with the right track, wrong track measure in its survey. And there are other political surveys that also ask that right track, wrong track. Just before we dive into the gender split there, right track, wrong track, how useful is it as an early indicator of any shift in political views within a population, and how has it shifted over the years? Because for me, it's been quite useful as a leading indicator on a shift. We saw it move dramatically in late 2021 during the COVID lockdowns in Auckland, and interestingly, the move that we've seen in the last month has actually been a bigger swing in views against right track to wrong track, and particularly amongst women, and interestingly, a really big shift amongst older women. So right track, wrong track, is it useful?
Yes, it is. And it sort of sits alongside one of those ones where, there's those different economic measures where you ask people whether they think now is a good time to buy a big purchase. Like that kind of stuff, like it's in that suite of measures. We firstly don't know how well it works in New Zealand because we don't have a lot of quantitative political scientists to sit there and crunch that number. So we don't know necessarily New Zealand specific, but I would suspect it picks up on the sentiment, or what we call the sentiment. You could also call it the vibe, like, that kind of whole idea of where is the public sitting? Are they feeling positive or negative? That data is particularly interesting because, of course, at the moment we can see that there's that negative sentiment, but it's not necessarily a negative sentiment where we have a government in waiting and Labor ready to pick up the mantle or pick up the government. So we're in this interesting place where perhaps we've got an overall negative sentiment, but not necessarily this bastion of hope. And I imagine some people will go, let's invest that in Kieran McAnulty, or, people had invested that in maybe Kitty Allen as someone who would, rise up and create this left group that, what Jacinda Ardern did in 2017. So we don't have someone or a group of parties that are ready to do that in opposition. So the reality of it is that it doesn't necessarily translate as a measure into political preference at this point.
And Lara, is there a gender split at all that you could tell? It might be too early. In some of the, you've got New Zealand First and ACT are quite strident, and actually National to some extent, if I think of some of the announcements Simeon Brown has made, quite strident steps to pull back from human rights commitments, particularly those to Maori. The like today, for example, there's this decision about referendums in local communities about Maori wards. Are you detecting that there's any sort of hostility to that, sort of putting things at risk, putting things that might have been assumed at risk?
I have not seen any, I have not specifically tested in any big data set like a gender difference in any of those kind of treaty related measures. I've got a PhD student at the moment that's looking at them in Canada and Australia. And actually what she's found is that women, shout out to Kaylee Brink, that women tend to support pro-Indigenous measures, from everything from the kind of land back type of measures through to commemorations of the sort of the schools related deaths and things along those lines in Canada, the residential schools. So we see that overseas, but I haven't necessarily analysed that data
Yeah.
here. So I would suspect that we would probably follow that pattern as well, where women are
And
more
in this-
supportive of Indigenous rights.
And in
yeah.
this gender gap that Bernard's talking about in the Ray, I was going to say Ray White, in the Roy Morgan survey.
Roy Morgan.
Yeah, not to bring everything back to housing, but is there any comparison with that teal phenomenon in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, when you saw particularly middle class women start to sort of break away from the Libs?
We haven't seen any indications of that yet, right? And we have a sort of completely different political system where it would be very hard for them to kind of create any kind of teal or independent movement. But that is an interesting question and a direction to watch in gender on the right, isn't it, in New Zealand? Because if you do have, we do have a considerable, and to some extent, Nicola Willis and Erica Stanford kind of represent those women a lot. The kind of more centrist, socially liberal, definitely pro-abortion, but very kind of pro-business and economic interests and feminists, that they would view themselves in that way. That maybe that this government's not representing that group as well. But I'd say that they're that more kind of neoliberal feminist part of the government landscape at the moment. So I haven't seen any rumblings of that in any data at this point, or in really much commentary, I'd say.
Just one thing I think it's worth mentioning for our audience who haven't seen the full table of support for the parties broken down by age group and gender. To give you an idea, Peter, you're asking, is there any evidence that we can see? For example, for men over the age of 50, currently 45% support National, 13% support New Zealand First. And when you look at, 9% support New Zealand First and 13% support ACT. So the three together, the three government parties, the support amongst 50 plus men is 67%.
Jesus, bloody old boomer bastards.
Yeah. But when you look at support amongst younger women, 18 to 49, for those three governing parties, it's 36.5%. So you're essentially saying support levels between old men versus young women is about 2 to 1. And when you look amongst young men and how they're spreading their support at the moment, young men are about 65% for the governing parties, and most interestingly, quite high for New Zealand First and for ACT, significantly higher than for women. And when you look on the other side, right now, young women are almost more supportive of the Greens and Māori Party together, so what you could call extreme left, versus the 29% who support Labour. So that younger group haven't certainly jumped on a Labour bandwagon. They're jumping on Greens and Māori Party at the moment. And also, when you look at the right track, wrong track direction, what you can see is that in the last month or so, older women, and I wonder if some of the noise around what I call culture war issues have started to follow through. And it's interesting to see that, for example, older women aged 50 plus are the largest supporters of Labour at the moment. But when you look at the right track, wrong track measure, the government confidence measure fell 24.5 percentage points in 1 month. And it was 18.5
in that group
percentage
of
points.
in that group of women.
50 plus. So what we're seeing is that a bunch of people have suddenly decided they don't like the direction the government's or the country is moving. Now, they haven't necessarily shifted their support to the opposition parties, but we're at a moment, I think, that's a little analogous. It's interesting that the size of the move is bigger than what we saw in those months of the COVID lockdowns in Auckland, which in my view were the key moments in the last election campaigns, where essentially Labour lost the support of the bulk of Middle New Zealand, particularly in Auckland. The size of the movement against the government's bigger in the last month than it was in any one of those months during COVID. And I think, and I'll put my views on the line here. I think that there is a good chance Christopher Luxon, who is now the most unpopular national prime minister since Jenny Shipley in 1998, that Christopher Luxon is gone as prime minister by the end of the year.
Ooh, are you
As
shorting
his lack
Christopher
of
Luxon?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no futures market I can use it for at the moment, but that's my personal view. Lara, you keep an eye on what's happening in the rest of the world. Is this? It looks like this isn't just a New Zealand phenomenon. What we're seeing around the world is this shift, it seems, between particularly young women versus young men and older men. And how do you think it might play out in elections? It's a big year for elections globally. We've got the US election for a start, but there's a bunch of them around. I mean, how do you think this might actually play out in the results?
It's quite concerning, and I think a lot of us are trying to get to grips with the internet, right? And its capacity for shared knowledge, shared discourse across countries. We can see, like I've just been following, listening to, reading about the Harvard Supreme Court case in the US and the arguments against affirmative action, and just seeing those mirrored in our own discourse around, say, the University of Auckland and a sign being put up and all of that. It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting to see how discourse
It's interesting who's driving this too.
Yes.
I thought Chloe Swarbrick really nailed it when she said last week, do we really want to be drawn into these foreign imported disputes? And,
that's exactly what I think a lot of us are thinking, yeah. Yeah. So
And
it's a case of, the internet perpetuating these ideas and seeing this gender split across places. There's this kind of joke that New Zealand is a few years behind everywhere else when it comes to these things. We're wondering if we would be the populist exception. Like a lot of us political scientists have a book literally called The Populist Exception ? About the 2020 election. And then we see that, no, we're not actually. We've got our own brand of it. And so that's where I will be watching the sort of any possible gender split appearing in the next
Lara,
few years.
you might have noticed overnight that the UK Reform Party, which is now polling above the Liberal Democrats and actually remarkably close to the Tories themselves in the UK, dumped two would-be candidates after a rather remarkable pressure group called Hope Not Hate found inevitably racist and rather fascist tweets from these candidates. I was reading through, as one is bound to do sometimes, swimming around in the sewer that X has become, Twitter has become. But there were a lot of people saying, actually, you're interfering with freedom of speech. This is what freedom of speech means. You're giving in to this anti-hate group. They're just a bunch of lefty, and I see some of that reflected in New Zealand, and it worries me. But then, I'm a progressive boomer tosser from Jervois Road.
Yeah, I definitely, one of the things I want to do is a study of the anti-Indigenous rhetoric around the world, because you can see the same things pop up in country after country, and especially in what we call the Kansas states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Yeah, you can see it just replicating over space, and there is a role. Obviously, the internet's got a role to play in that. We've got a role to play in that, and one of the things I was talking about earlier is like
just so that what's got a role to play in the MP. What did you say?
Just the internet. So it is. It's like just totally fundamentally, and those shared discourses and things being imported. But then also and I struggle with this discussion a lot, because you don't want to tone police or tell a minority group, no, actually, you're not allowed to be angry. But what is the best way to end polarization, or to create like a positive sense of masculinity for young men, or to create a positive sense of Pākehā identity? And so that's one of the things that we kind of, as a broader society, have to figure out how to grapple with, right? Like, how do we then create that positive sense of whatever it is that we need to create?
Yeah, or just maybe we decide not to.
Right.
Maybe we just decide not to be complete pricks the whole time. I mean, there's so much, there's so much rudeness and meanness.
Economic inequality.
In these discussions.
How do you do that
Exactly.
in increasing economic inequality as well? So there's a lot of issues, and they're reflected in public opinion.
Yeah. One of the interesting sources for analysis of electoral views and how it translates into election results is the New Zealand election study, which actually I don't think a lot of New Zealanders really understand is out there and how important it is. Could you just briefly, for our audience, explain what the New Zealand election study is and what sort of research and insight it gives everyone, 3 years in the 3-year cycle?
Yeah, so since 1990, a team of political scientists in New Zealand has run the election study. Like every election, all the data is sitting there on the Australian Data Archive if anyone wants to, get the hobby of analysing it. And from time to time, we actually do see the odd person just like creating all sorts of cool tools with it. And basically, we just send a survey to, it's been always between 2,000 and 4,000 New Zealanders. I think actually one time it was 7,000 people back in the 90s when we had money. And it was like, you just send out the survey and people fill out their political views, and you do get a good cross section of people. And it's seriously the day or the week after the election, so it's fresh in their mind. And that is when we can go back and test things. Like last time we tested that whole idea that was it farmers switched to Labour to keep the Greens out, which there was no evidence of. All of those hypotheses and theories we have. Like there's this joke that polls are designed to like tell us that our friends are wrong. And it's that same sort of thing where it's like it's an actual base of data for like where all of these like what does the average person think, and that's what we use it for generally. And we tend to write a book each time, and yeah, so the 2023 data is in and people are analyzing it now, and it'll be open access at some point. So yeah, we just
Yeah, well,
political
I'm
scientists
really looking.
study it every year, every time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, data palooza. We love a good data set here on the Kaka,
Pretty
and
much.
I'm looking forward to the next one. Lara, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you very much. We'd love to
Thank
have
you,
you
Lara.
on again. And good luck. And I hope that some government somewhere provides some funding to ensure that this sort of research and analysis goes on. Because at the moment, and this is me speaking here, universities right around the country are in the process of downsizing, and not just them, but the broader science community is under, they would say, attack, but certainly under enormous pressure to reduce staff and spending, when actually understanding ourselves and our world helps makes
Well,
us
you mean
better off
getting
and
getting
richer.
a common sort of data platform to understand who we actually are?
Well,
Jesus,
a
steady on.
shared view of the world is how we all move forward. At the moment, we have a bunch of splintered, competing, shouting views of the world, which is starting to affect how democracies work. And we're
Well,
starting
it's
to see
very
that play out and these gender gaps.
Yeah, it's interesting how you should say that, Bernard. And I imagine you may be interested in this, Lara. I interviewed for another project Penny Hulse, the former deputy mayor of Auckland, and a woman called Gail Surgener, who is a sort of well-known person in that fifth estate, or whatever you call that sort of area of social work and so on. And both of them were making the point that with the fracturing of media, and particularly the weaknesses in some media, and we were partly talking about local body reporting, is that there's no common view on what the truth actually is. And that gives way to cynicism then. That, so, for example, if you're the mayor of West Auckland or Waitakere, or the council, you have no local paper as such anymore to really communicate or hold you to account. So then it just fractures into a whole bunch of Facebook groups. And when the media does talk to you, they're talking about some crisis and they're making you look like an idiot. It's just an interesting idea that it's absent at the moment, that kind of common view of things.
Yeah, totally. Like that shared sense of community, or shared sense of identity. I mean, there's so much stuff going back to, we always in first year politics were always like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone book from 2001, where the whole idea is that we don't have a shared sense of community anymore, and that's the downfall of society, and now people don't vote even. Like that's that whole argument, and it's definitely increasingly so. And that, I mean, that is where there's that positive potential of things like the internet actually to create community and to create positive spaces and to use AI and technology, and that's definitely a whole other conversation. To actually start being positive about these things and creating that in some way, but also somehow not doing it like beholden to Meta and Google, which again, like I don't know the answer there, but yeah,
Maybe if we set
it's
up a
it's a
sort of
whole.
75 or $100 million annual fund to support the media, and it was, contestable, and we just bid to New Zealand on air, that
Me
wouldn't raise
first,
any
me first.
that wouldn't raise any problem for it. But thank you so much, Lara.
Thank you very much, Lara. And on that topic of the media, we have our end of the show skateboarding dog story, which is out of Peter's roundup of the media news, we're talking about ways, business models for journalists to do interesting work. Peter, there's a new type of business model which has cropped up, which seems to be getting some money, some investment. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, it is. I wouldn't have thought it was a skateboarding dog. It's possibly more for our early session when we sometimes talk about media, but it's a creation of a kid I know, a young man I know, Nathaniel Brooks Horowitz, who I'm very close to his parents, and he has raised $100 million to set up a thing called Hunterbrook Media. And so they released their first story this week, and it's about it's essentially a very negative story about one of the biggest US mortgage lenders, UWM, and it exposes a whole bunch of alleged wrongdoing. The difference between this and any other kind of investigative journalism, though, is that Hunterbrook also is a financial organisation and has bet against the shares, has shorted the shares of UWM and gone long or bought the shares or invested in the shares of its main rival in the expectation that its news story will damage the share price of UWM and that therefore there's money to be made. Hunterbrook is also participating in, or trying to encourage really, a class action lawsuit against UWM. So it may be able to make money both out of the share price fall triggered by its reporting and from any sort of massive payout in a class action suit. And this is, you and I, Bernard, have worked at places where we're not even allowed to own individual shares rather than funds. The ethics of this are really difficult, but some really serious journalists, apart from Nathaniel, who's not by birth a journalist, although his parents are both Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, Geraldine Brooks and Tony Horowitz. He's got people like the former two former Wall Street Journal editors, Matt Murray and Paul Steiger, working in this organization, and their whole thing is transparency. They say, you can trust our journalism because it's gone through normal journalistic standards, but we are totally clear about what the agenda is here, which is to short stock or invest in stock and make movement and then make money on our news. Now, I find this really both horrifying and intriguing, because if they're fully transparent, I do see danger ahead in this. I mentioned in the thing that I wrote, I talked at one point to the founder of Muddy Waters Research, which is famous for releasing unbelievably negative research reports on which it's already traded and then continues to trade it, as does the cleverly named Hindenburg, and we all know what happened to the Hindenburg.
The humanity.
It virtually blew up Adani, the Indian energy and so on conglomerate. So I don't know. I see hideous ethical questions here.
And there is, so essentially we've gone from public interest journalism to insider trading journalism.
That's right.
Which is,
But is it insider trading if we're totally transparent?
Well, you're transparent with your own investment fund, but not the public. Otherwise, that's not going to work. But there is one final step down this track, Peter, and that is to do investigations into wrongdoing, to be ready to go with a story, and then to approach the subject of the investigation and say, "Pay me money, or I'd make it public."
I've most certainly seen and heard that kind of thing. That happens. I've heard of it happening in Kenya.
A bunch of companies in China have used it. Yep.
Yeah, things like that have been hinted at. Yeah. You and I would never do such a thing, even for an ice cream company or a wine company.
No, it is quite a weird place we're going to. Peter Bale, our co-host for the Hoon, thank you very much for this show from your bookshop. And I am Bernard Hickey for the Hoon here from Waiheke Island.
Is there a decent bookshop in Waiheke Island, Bernard?
I haven't found one yet.
You need to
start one,
okay,
Peter.
That's a very good idea. That's a very good idea.
See you later, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye. Thank you so much, everybody.